Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. I hope those of you who listened to the last 3 episodes on opening men to therapy and therapy to men found the podcasts to not only interesting but also useful in the sense of giving the whole process of maybe entering therapy some thoughts, some deeper thought than you might have had prior to those episodes. As I intimated, I think the important aspect about the whole issue about masculinity is how we're socialised and what the ups and downs are in that socialisation with regards to putting our hand up for help or even just change, positive change, growth. In essence, it doesn't matter, how you define it. Therapy, as I said, is not just about getting fixed. That idea is fundamentally a very medical idea. It's rooted in the whole idea of pathology. And, yes, it's an important aspect to the whole psychological process, but it's not the only part. So if you've got any feedback for me, I'm happy to hear it. If you've got any ideas for future podcasts in that vein or in any vein, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'm always interested in having an open, meaningful dialogue with people who are engaging in a respectful way on the topics that I'm raising. So in this particular podcast, I want to do a little bit of a segue, and part of it's been prompted by some serious issues in the media, but also I've encountered the same issues on an individual basis, on in my client work, in my mentoring and counselling, my therapy work, and I thought it's probably worthwhile, like the notion of therapy, to unpack this. So what am I talking about? Well, fundamentally, I want to talk about the issues about ethics, morals, and values. Now, for those of you who are really familiar with my podcasts overall already will know that when it comes to parenting, one of the things that I focus on in my parenting strategies is not so much to have rules, but actually to create an environment where children are raised through modelling between their parents, but also they're raised directly with getting engaged in a process where everything's based and comes back to values. All right? A client of mine the other day said to me, well, so stuff the rules, basically, is what I'm saying. I sort of said, well, to a degree, there really still is a need for some rules, but we don't need volumes of rules, right? So let's come back to this issue about values, because as I said, it is the foundation that directs my relationship with myself, but also it gives direction to my relationship with others, not just in how I think and feel, but also in the decisions that I make with regards to my actions. Okay? So let me unpack this. Okay, so let's put a structure around it. So we're talking about, let's put rules aside for a moment. Let's look at values. Okay? So the question then that would immediately come to mind is, well, what are values? How do we define them? What are they about? Let me just lay the foundation for the next question, which is about morals. What is morality? Now, I'm going to be very, very straight up and down with that, and that is a lot of people want to argue that morals exist because of our religious backgrounds. And I argue quite strongly against that. We can have a strong morality without religion. It's called secular morality, okay? And the other part to this is the issue about ethics, okay? So let me work through this one step at a time. Now, at this point in time, I'm sort of going along fairly organically with this whole thing. You know, if you watch the media at the moment, particularly, in the United States, in the UK, and Australia, there are some real issues where people are asking about someone's ethics and their moral code and the questions around their ethics. Right now in our state, we've got an independent investigation into corruption with our previous premier about her conduct, whether it was ethical. So let's start with personal values. What are they? So, by and large, values are the foundation of an individual's ability to judge between right and wrong. Values include a deep-rooted systems of beliefs that guide your decisions, right? So they're generally formed on a personal level, and they influence my behaviour. So I'll give you an example. In the whole issue about patriarchy and in gender debates, the question of equality is central in the dialogue. Okay, so one of my values in that case is about equality. Okay, so now let's not debate whether that's right or wrong for a moment. Let's just think about it. So let me give you some examples of some values. And again, we're looking at a personal level. So one of my values might be to be honest. I might also value commitment, right? So in a relationship basis, that commitment may be much, much more about being open and prepared to go to counselling if the relationship's in difficulty, rather than simply getting out of the relationship. Now, the one that I want to focus on a little bit more specifically is the whole notion of integrity. This is particularly relevant in the examination of, right or wrongdoings within the political sphere. Okay, so what you'll hear from a lot of politicians is they value integrity. Now, fundamentally, what does that mean? Well, it's actually quite simple on one level, and that is that if I value integrity, then if I do something wrong, I'm going to admit to that. I'm going to hold myself accountable. In essence, no matter what the consequences. It's not a matter of, I'll only do that if I can get away with it or I can soften the consequences. Okay. Now, some of you might be starting to think about this in the legal framework, and I'm going to ask you not to do that. There's a significant difference. And I don't have the time or necessarily, the knowledge base and skill set to go into that in depth. Maybe what I'm going to do is ask a friend of mine who's a lawyer to come on board for a podcast on that issue, because I think it's becoming more and more important in a society that's been challenged over the last few years on many, many different levels, where values are critical. They're central to the issue. Okay, so we're talking about values, which are inherently individual, but I can also extend that to my relationship and my family, and to some degree, with possibly some influence, to my social network. Okay, so let's now talk about morals. We often bring morals and values together, and we talk about moral values. And essentially, morals are a system of beliefs that emerge from our core values. They're specific and they apply to the context. And usually it's about my desire to be good. Okay, this is where the connection often comes into the religious framework. But again, we don't need to be religious in order to have a moral framework. So let me give you some examples of morals. So if I go back to the doing right or wrong thing, right? So in my view, it's bad to steal. It's bad to lie. Because I have some very clear values around that. So I'll give you an example that's a little bit out of left field, but if my value is ambition, then I'm going to allow myself to do things in order to meet that value, to meet my ambitions that may not be good. Now, an easy one is that if I've got a strong need to succeed, right, then I'm going to go, working late, working 14, 15 hours a day is a good thing. Now, as a health professional, I'm going to challenge you on that and go, is that really what you want to do? Because ultimately the question is it sustainable? So if you're saying that one of your values is a healthy lifestyle, then working late is going to be a contradiction to that. Right? So is going to be, success at all cost, or, ambition is more important than health. So this is where things interrelate. We need to start thinking about how this works together. It's all very well to say I've got integrity, yet take bribes. Well, that's not true. If I take bribes, I don't have any integrity. So when I see a person's behaviour, part of that is going to make me think about where their behaviour originates. Where's it come from? Right? So if the question that I often pose in discussions, especially on a philosophical level, is, how is it that good people can do bad things? Right? Or how is it that bad people can do good things? That's a particularly interesting question to ask. Okay, so let me move into this issue about morals and ethics. In reality, morals and ethics are actually quite similar. And some people, in fact, do use them interchangeably. I tend to be a bit more specific about it, and my suggestion is think about it as morals are concerned with the individuals feeling good or bad. Ethics are about behaviours that are right or wrong. So, for example, in my profession as a health professional, one of my ethics is to do no harm. Okay, it's an overriding principle, but I've also adapted that into my life as a whole. Now, obviously, I'm not perfect, so occasionally I will do something that in hindsight I go, oh yeah, I should have thought about the consequences, and it might be just a slight, So, for example, if I don't respond to my partner's needs, and I could respond to my partner's needs, then I'm in essence doing harm, and I don't want to do that. Okay, so there's lots of ways in which ethical frameworks are structured and implemented. Implementation in ethics is a particularly important thing. So in most organisations, we have a code of conduct or a code of ethics. Right? So we're bound when we join an organisation to understand what those ethics are and what my conduct is going to look like in relationship to that. So, for example, doctors, have a strict code of ethics when they swear on the Hippocratic Oath. one of the challenges, and this was where it gets interesting in law, is that a defence lawyer is ethically bound to do his best to defend a person who's been charged with a crime. Now, that's irrespective of their own set of values. Now, personally, this is where it gets really interesting. On a personal reflection, I'm not sure I could really do that. For me, one of the things that I talk a lot about is that I need to have a sense of alignment between my values, my moral framework, and my ethics, both personally but also socially. They've got to resonate. There's got to be a harmony for me. Otherwise, I'm going to feel really conflicted. So now you might be asking, why is all of this important? Why am I bringing this up in a podcast about inspiring change? Well, firstly, who I am as a person involves me having values, having morals, and having a certain ethical framework that I operate within. Okay, otherwise I'm going to be bouncing around the joint like a ball without any clear direction. So one of the results of that is often, either deep feelings of shame or deep feelings of guilt or both. So there is a direct psychological impact. In one of the podcasts I've talked about, Vietnam veterans having a moral injury. Okay, so this is where it becomes very relevant and where we can't necessarily just talk about the psychology of us as human beings, but we also need to understand what underpins our thinking. Not just what we think, but how we think and how this connects. How does it influence what I feel? Right? The stronger my relationship to my values are, and my moral code and my framework of ethics, the more resilient I'm going to be. And that is a really, really important factor. Personally, it's really interesting because when I see, say, for example, politicians or anybody acting immorally or amorally, one of the first things that comes to my mind is, how can they not live without anxiety? There's got to be some anxiety. Now, I know as a psychologist that, the only group that doesn't, have a negative emotional reaction to breaching their values or morals or ethics is the psychopath. Now, they're not that common, really. In the scheme of things, demographically, there's only a very small percentage in the population. Thank God. Well, for goodness sake. Right? So, for those of you religious, I'm not blaspheming. It's just a turn of phrase. But I'm very, very pleased that there's only relatively small numbers in the population. And that doesn't include the destructively narcissistic person. There's a lot more of those. Okay? So this is very much about, points of growth for us as individuals within the context of our community. We talk a lot about freedom. So I have a freedom to express myself, but I also have a responsibility. Otherwise, unlike Margaret Thatcher's assertion that there is no thing as society, we truly would not have a society. We would not have a culture. Within culture is a framework of morality and ethics. And when they're discordant, when they're not aligned with one another, we have problems. Now, in some environments, we've obviously abandoned the idea that it's bad to lie, because no matter how strong the evidence that we're lying, we persist with it. Now, in my book, that is a very, very immature way of behaving. One of the things that I do as I bring up children, or if I'm coaching or counselling, teenagers especially, I'm going to challenge them into looking at their sets of values and how well those values dictate their behaviour. Because they're in a learning process. They're discovering that, if I don't have behaviour or I don't act on behaviour that's aligned with my values or my morality, I'm going to be in trouble. Now, sometimes as adolescents, we want to weasel out of that. But the reality is, as an adult, to do that is seriously problematic. And a person who does that should not, in my view, be part of any form of leadership. We need to have systems, therefore, of accountability, of checks and balances, and we need to be able to call people on it, and they need to have and experience consequences as a result of that. Otherwise, anarchy rules. Okay, some food for thought, and I hope you're going to join me for the next episode, which is actually looking at how morality develops. So it's going to be a little bit more about parenting, but we're going to put the lens on moral development. And until next time, I hope you're going to join me. And this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.